most Sufis would not like to marry, even if Prophet and maintain a family. Only poor people cannot maintain a family, so they will not marry. So, and this was a struggle in the Sufi tradition, very, frequently, as to how do we devote ourselves completely in love of God when we are also part of the material world and maintaining family. From wanted Raziuddin to meet, to marry the daughter of a person known to her. Saying no to her would be an embarrassment to both her and Raziuddin. So what would Raziuddin do? He told her of the incident of his meeting a yogi visiting Sheikh Raziuddin's first part. The yogi had made Raziuddin memorized the proposition that the character of a child was determined on the day of the month parents had sex and child conceived. Different month had different characters assigned to the concept. So 20 kinds of characters were already determined. The yogi was suggesting that the people do not know the right timing for sex, and that is why sometimes useless creatures are born. लोग सेक्स करने का सही टाइम नहीं जानते हैं, so all kinds of बदमाश लोग पैदा हो जाते हैं. फारसी में ऐसा सुनने को लगता है, you will understand this. फरजंदान के बेज़ौक बेलून नहीं आए, वो बेज़ौक लौंडे जो पैदा होते हैं माँ के पेट से. ऑनर्स के मर्दमान वक्त मुबाशरत नमी दाना, लोग सेक्स का टाइम नहीं जानते हैं. This is yogi ideas. So all the first day this character, second day this character. Now this was heard by Baba Farid. He got very angry that why are we doing this? This is not our practice. So there is a difference between yogic way of looking at the bodily practices, etc., and Sufi way of cleansing the self, etc., out of all kinds of sexual desires, etc., for the divine. So on hearing all these, the veteran Fariduddin scolded young Raziuddin. Why was he wasting his time in such matters? Sufis were wary of yogic tricks, and also Raziuddin was going to grow in the mystic path and therefore wedded completely to God. So Sufi position was very clear that sometimes yogis speak in a language that sounds similar to Sufi language, and yet it is not Sufi, and therefore that distinction has to be, and difference has to be maintained. If not, then you will cease to become Sufi, you begin to become yogi. We know what happened to the Qalandars, Qalandars of the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century, completely deviant, friends of God, friends of Allah. Qalandars, Hadris, Qawwali, these were the mystics, unruly friends of God, as Karam Mustafa historian would call them. In the 19th, 20th century, those Qalandars have become Dashnasis. And practices in terms of the almost entirely Persian, which has now in the 2024-25 is being completely now changed to Sanskritized. So अमृत काल में आपको संस्कृत लैंग्वेज में स्नान करना पड़ेगा, शाही स्नान as you would previously do. So Padma Sam, she understood the message conveyed here and withdrew the proposal, saying she was just checking out. She was still interested in the idea of marriage, as I said, but many Sufis thought they cannot handle it and therefore remained unmarried. Some triple talaq also have the sense that Raziuddin Bhakti of Nizamuddin Auliya was the most famous of the Sufis of the period, and narrowly after him. He had married once, maybe second or third time. So one of his disciples saw the Prophet in dream, saying that how is it that Baba Sahib is no longer sending the flower ka guldasta that he used to send every night. So he came back to Qutb Sahib and said that this is what he has seen in the dream. So he called his wife, newly wedded wife, and saying, "Suno Baran, हमको माफ कर दो, हमसे नहीं हो सकेगा." Because every night was spent in reading the Durud and different kinds of wazifa, etc., and salam to the Prophet that was taught because so had to do a triple talaq, which I think is one of the earliest examples, known examples in Indian tradition. Shadi kiya aur biwi ko rafa kar diya. There's another time when we have time in discussion, I will give another very interesting example of triple talaq. कागज पे लिख के लगाकर हमसे नहीं समझेगा तुम जो चाहो. So for Sufis, the nights were spent in prayers and meditation, in remembering God, and days in service to followers, devotees, and various other kinds of visitors to the hospice, such as the yogis, as just mentioned. Several scholars have worked on this: Simon Digby, Muzaffar Alam. Historians have worked on it. Previously, Nurul and all the best of historians have worked on Sufism. If you read their work, some glimpses of what I'm saying is already written out there. My next example is Nirguna, various strands of Bhakti devotional movements in medieval India condemned religious rituals, criticized caste-based hierarchies and discrimination, advocated the need for it to discover a formless God inside one's own heart. This is the Nirguna tradition. Some traditions of Bhakti are also identified as Hindu religious movements revolving around Shri Rama Payodhya, Maryada Purushottam, as an epitome of virtues and juxtaposed with becoming so very popular that we needed some movements. So Bhakti emerges in a big way. Ram Bhakti especially becomes a big thing since the 16th century. Remember, Ramcharitmanas is a vocal text, late 16th century onwards. So those saint poets such as Kabiruddin Shah for Muslims, or Kabir Sahib, and Guru Nanak, Baba Nanak Shah of Muslims, transcended contentious political boundaries of Islam and Hindu traditions. Religious fields were often marked by violent formation of communities. So teachers were, gurus were teaching something, followers were their dead bodies. The spiritual masters were involved also sometimes in competitive spirituality of sorts, in terms of appropriating ideas and attracting followers. But this was not necessarily to organize them as violent communities. But communities happen. Communities happen sometimes very constructors, around communities formed could become very hostile against other communities. Similar to each other. The disciples make twisting the teachings of the gurus or Sufis or yogis, sants. In many cases, the followers therefore completely transform the original teachings of the spiritual leaders, and communities formed around their teachings often sought to use political power to demean and subdue each other. It becomes identity contestation and communalism is a reality that the country, society is faced with historically, last 200 years especially. But when we go back to Bhakti of the older times, or Sufi traditions, Bhakti could be understood as an expression of love, devotion, and sharing. Intended as emotional songs of powerful social protest, and it can be a violent language of politics as well, as we see in decades. In times of social political crisis, and also defining movement as a matter of heart and above divisive politics. Consensus on religious questions in Indian history not properly understood the complex intricacies of devotional traditions. Community relations have to be dealt with in a manner that is above divisive politics, not pitting communities against each other. Irrespective of the political considerations of the time, a number of scholars have contributed immensely to multidimensional Bhakti historiography in recent decades. And I am just mentioning here David Lorenzen, Jack Hawley, formidable scholarship of Charlotte Baudeville on Kabir, Linda Hess once again, Philip Ludgendorff on Ramcharitmanas, Tulsi, and more recently Christian Lee University's very fine work on Namdev tradition. Namdev is all over 13th, 14th, 15th century in Marathi, Gujarati, Rajasthani, Punjabi. But for the first time, we get to know about him in writing through his own compositions and on him from the late 16th century. So for 300 years, we did not know anything about it. So maybe memory and history can be used together to build a narrative that there was a Bhakti public in the 16th century which remembered the Namdev tradition, historically going back 300 years. Together, all these scholars have aimed at understanding the emotional expression of love for the divine in broader Hindu traditions, which in some contexts gets transformed. And Hawley has written a very interesting sentence in one of his books on how Bhakti is part of our national, broader national identity formation, etc. Bhakti is needed. Late 16th century text, Bhakti ki Mala, the garland of Bhakti mediates across boundary markers, intellectual and emotional, classical and vernacular, regional and national, powerful as well as weak. It stands in the middle of much of the life of religion in India and elsewhere. It may not cover the waterfront, but truly it does bridge. Bhakti जोड़ते हैं लोगों को bridge. Medieval Bhakti sants made sustained efforts to unite people into an egalitarian brotherhood, worshipping the same God, whether formless or otherwise. This God was named in, as I said in the beginning, Arabic as Allah, in Persian Khuda. Ways and forms of worship could differ, but in essence they led to the same goal of achieving equality before a monotheistic and merciful God. Required Ekeshwarvad, building temple and also sometimes crossing the bridge if required to make the message sound more meaningful and in the language and dialects of the people of all their varied social backgrounds. You will see that Kabir did it, Gorakhnath did it, as Baba Farid did it in Punjab. In devotional movements in medieval India was a relentless emphasis on the idea of a loving God, monotheistic, unity of God, and the need for equality and respect for all his creations, human and non-human beings. Let me give some examples from what Gorakh 12th century period, what Gorakhpani recorded in the 13th, 14th century period, and how the Gorakhpani through the medieval period down to the early 20th century when Gorakhpani text was compiled as an acceptable text by Barthawal, very famous. Unfortunately, the yogi tradition is now forgetting the original teachings of Gorakhnath kind. So one of the most respected scholars of Bhakti movements, whose name I mentioned, David Lorenzen, has explored the question of religious identities. There is Hindu, and Muslim, and Yogi, and Sant, 4 different kinds. And we also include Sufis, so 5. Yogis are not always Hindus, Sants are not always Hindu or Muslim. Sufis transcended everything above the. He has done it in the teaching, through the teachings of one of the most prominent medieval yogi, Gorakhnath, and Kabir Sahib, Sant Kabir. Though much of the lives and teachings of both Gorakhnath and Kabir remain shrouded in legends, it is possible to cull out some of the essence of their teachings through compositions attributed to them since medieval times. As I said, Gorakhnath may have lived in the period between 11th and were subsequently compiled in a well-known collection of his poetical compositions about its reliability in terms of what Gorakhnath might have. As an accomplished yogi, Gorakhnath distinguished himself from formal and ritualistic Hindu traditions and considered himself closer to Sufi-oriented Islam. Yogi, Gorakhnath was very appreciative of Sufis, and I have some 3-4 very interesting examples that brings it out very clearly. He says he originated as a Hindu, matured as a yogi, and was a Muslim by intellect. Muslim by intellect in the 11th century. उत्पत्ति हिंदू, जन्म योगी, अखिल परी मुसलमानी. उत्पत्ति से हिंदू हैं, मेडिटेशन करके योगी बनी हैं और अकल से मुसलमान बनने लायक हैं. Now, paying tribute to Muslim intellect might sound contradiction in terms in these times, our times, in all around deterioration in Islam. Because Islam का मतलब terrorism होता है. But Goraknath lived in a standards of excellence in many fields of expertise, Abbasid Umayyad and Abbasid Empire, large sultanates, then the Ottoman, the Safavids, the Mughals, large empires in the 17th, 18th, up to the 18th century before colonialism, imperialism happens, to change the world. So the Goraknath, like Kabir, subsequently could notice how the Islam. So he was making a distinction between the Islam, the way the Mullah people, the Qazi people do, and they were unable to follow the correct path, therefore, Ra. He recognized that through established spiritual practices and deep contemplation, the Sufi Darwishes were able to discover the door to the house of the Lord. So, Sufi log भगवान के घर के दरवाजे को जानते थे. So you say दरवेश सोई जो दर की जाने, सोई दरवेश अल्लाह की जाति. So दरवेश लोग अल्लाह की जाति के थे क्योंकि वो अल्लाह के घर के दरवाजे को जानते थे और इसलिए उनको दरवेश कहते हैं. ऐसे उन्होंने एक्सप्लेनेशन दिया है. Several other verses strongly reject Muslim and Hindu rituals and highlight the virtues of a separate and superior tradition. Anticipating Kabir's iconoclasm later in the 15th, 16th century, Goraknath then only proclaimed, and this is a very interesting line that is often ignored. Hindus worship in temples, Muslims go to mosque, but the yogis spend time in meditation in the presence of the omnipotence, where there is neither a temple nor a mosque. Hindu dhyave devra, Musliman masjid. Yogi dhyave parmat, jama devra na masjid. This is very clearly written out. Further distancing himself from both Hindu and Muslim traditions, which were based on particular readings of the scriptures such as Vedas and Quran, Goraknath pointed out that the verses on the secrets of the Supreme Being are not intelligible to Mullah, Qazi, Pandits, etc. It is we, yogis, are able to understand better. Tepa jana birla yogi और दुनिया सब धंधे लाई. ये जोगी करेक्ट मीनिंग समझते हैं स्क्रिप्चर्स की, बाकी लोग उसे धंधेबाजी में हैं. So this is not very interesting. Now Gorakdhanda is a word which sounds like deception, but here is it positively. For the other parties are in dhandebazi with regard to religion and interpretation of religion, etc. scriptures. So Goraknath's compositions clearly bring out four distinct religious positions: the dominating and formal Islamic and Hindu traditions, as well as mystical world of the yogis, which was confident enough to recognize the value of the mystic path of the Sufis. So yogis, Sufis, and Hindus and Muslims generally, they could live together. Reaching the latter half of the 15th and early decades of the 16th centuries, Kabir, who is supposed to have died 1518, so late 15th century, early 16th century, though legends will say that he might have lived longer, he went a step further, locating himself right at the center of the marketplace, Kabira Khada Bazaar mein, the latter religious leaders, Sufis and yogis. So he was criticizing everyone. He criticized the ritual of animal sacrifice among Hindus, but he reserved his choicest language for condemnation of slaughter of animals by Muslims. So this is my favorite line. He मुर्गी किस फरमाया किसके कहे तुम छुरी चलाया और दिन को रोजा रहा था रात खाना था गाय. So this is no contradiction. This is लोग दिन को रोजा रख सकते हैं, रात को कुछ खा सकते हैं, रात को गाय खा रहे हैं. And now from 15th century, beef eating has become a big controversial issue. We know that Raziuddin in Kashmir, anticipating Akbar 100 years, had banned slaughter of cow, etc. So दिन को रोजा रहे थे, रात खाना था गाय. चोरी करे, जबाही करे, कहते हैं जा किया हलाल करे. Because Muslims are also obsessed about halal, haram, binary, and the need for doing halal, in such a way that not one big bang and head is done away with of the animal, but you cut lovingly the nerves of the animal. जानवर की जान गई है भाई, ठीक है. So अब क्या हलाल और क्या हराम, लेकिन मजहब में ये मैटर करता है. For yogis, Kabir's advice was that the spiritual practices like the pranayama and other forms of meditation are of no use till the time the heart of the person concerned was not cleansed and Ram discovered it. This is a very important. There are Sufis They are standing on their head and do samadhi for 40 days. Sufis can hang themselves upside down with a branch of a tree overlooking a well in a mosque courtyard, and they call it Chillai Makus or Namaz Makus or Salat Makus. 40 days of inverted chilla, in the darkness of the night, spectacle. And there are some paintings available already from the 17th, 18th century. Baba Farid practicing it on the advice of Qutb Sahib. Chillai Makus किए हो रही क्या होता है? अपने पैर को उल्टा टांग करके कुआं में झाँको 40 दिन तक 40 रात तक एक मस्जिद के कोर्टयार्ड में in the middle of the night. Think of the biochemistry of the body what could be happening. Instead, Abu Sa'id Abul Khair in Khurasan had done it, and before that Prophet Muhammad had done it. So for all legitimacy, in all likelihood, Prophet Muhammad would not do this. He would not even know this. He would be meditating in the car, his mind, etc. But not certainly this, Udmukhi sadhu kind of practice of hanging upside down. So it is important to take cognizance of, even celebrate in other contexts when community relations are rupturing, the extraordinary life and legends of sons like Kabir for his continuing relevance to questions of communal harmony and social justice, which are often marred by aggressive religious contestations and political violence. As a syncretic kind of figure, borrowing ideas from different religions to make it something different and his own, with possible Brahman antecedents and an abandoned child brought up in a Muslim weaver's family, Kabir is well known as a Bhakti son of iconoclastic ideas, social hierarchies, and religious hypocrisies in the political context of the Lodi of that the Pandits of Banaras and the Mullahs of Banaras had criticized to Sikandar Lodi. So Sikandar Lodi had intervened on their behalf to say that इनको अपना काम करने दीजिए. Kabir को especially said आप इनको आप दिल्ली चलिए, यहाँ आपको नहीं रहने देंगे. And Raidas ठिकाना in Delhi is in threat now. The coexistence of different religious groups, exhorting the people to have a vision, and this is a very interesting remark that Sufis, Kabir has also done, exhorting the people to have a vision, darshan of the Lord in the mirror of one's own heart. Kabir advised in a verse compiled in a well-known collection of his poetic compositions, Granthawali of Kabir, that the mirror needed continuous cleansing of the filth gathered on it. कितना अच्छा लाइन सुनिए, जो दर्शन देखिए चाहिए तो दर्पण मंजत रहे, तब दर्शन किया ना जाए. जब भगवान का दर्शन करना है तो वो जो मिरर में उसको मांजते रहिए, साफ करते रहिए. जब दर्पण लागे काई, जब दर्पण में काई लग जाएगी तब दर्शन किया ना जाए. Kabir's attack on Muslim religious leaders, ulama and qazi, not sparing Sufis either. Sufis of his time who would be running the tombs and mazars and dargahs, spirituality and would make him an interesting case for appropriation in Vaishnava Brahmanical Saguna tradition of medieval Ram Bhakti. There was continuous pressure on Kabir to say about it, and you should become part of our practice, Vaishnava Brahmanical Saguna variety. On the other hand, his non-Brahmanical Hindu followers, the Kabir Panthis, believed in the Nirguna or formless God. Beginning as a Sufi disciple of Sheikh Taqi of Kadamanipur, later Allahabad, Prayagraj, all boundaries. In doing so, he was searching for common grounds, as Jogis and Sufis also had done. Similarly, Kabir's contemporary Sufis, who believed in the concept of Wahdatul Wujud, monism or unity of existence, which was certainly different from the idea of the monotheistic God, Tawheed, one God who has created everything. So there is a duality. But here it is Wahdatul Wujud is about everything is one. God has created, so there is the hand of God in everything. So everything can be in turn identified as having an attribute of God, and therefore God. So Kabir's contemporary Sufis who believed in the concept of Wahdatul Wujud, monism or unity of being, existence, appropriated yogic ideas and practices, presented in a text, very famous text called Amrit Kund, the Arabic and Persian translation of which were much in demand in Sufi circles of medieval India. Amrit Kund, the pool of nectar, Hawzul Hayat, Babul Hayat, etc. It's a yogic text. And one of the Sufi enthusiasts was the leading Chishti Sabri Sufi, Abdul Qudus Gangohi, of the late 15th, early 16th century, accessed this text from his strong position as a responsible Muslim religious leader and found no contradiction in styling himself as Alag Das in his own mystical poetry in Hindi, Alag Niranjan. So he's a Chishti Sabri Sufi writing poetry in Hindi and calling himself pen name, as Alag Das. And yet he's very conscious of his being Muslim. It's not that he was compromising on his Muslimness altogether to lose his identity completely. He would even conflate distinctions to say that there was no difference between notions of monistic Wahdatul Wujud, which sections of Sufis found similar to Advaita philosophy, non-duality, and monotheistic Tawheed, that is one God, emphasized by the ulama, Sunni Islamic scholars of medieval India. So therefore, in the Sufi Bhakti milieu of medieval India, the formless God was called by Alag Niranjan, Kabir's own search for Wahdatul Wujud, and as I said, not necessarily Tawheed, because Tawheed will have that distinction between soul and the human being, Atma and Paramatma, would be conflicting. Can be seen in his claim of the possibility of complete assimilation of both the creator and creations. Very interesting doha here. Khaliq, बनाने वाला, creator, and Khalaq, which is the created thing. Khaliq, Khalaq में Khaliq, सब घट रही हो समाई. So Khaliq or Khalq, they could be together, on the same ghat, same form, same ghat perhaps of Banaras. Putting it more simply, Kabir typically announced as कहे कबीर एक राम जब पूरे हिंदू तुरक ना कोई. This is very, very clear, very, very aggressively emphasized. कहे कबीर एक राम जब पूरे हिंदू तुरक ना कोई. Chant the name of one God, not discriminating between Hindus and Muslims. And therefore, free from prejudices, Kabir's language of devotion was considered a blessing for all. An early appreciation of Kabir's life and teaching may be seen in, as I mentioned, Bhakmal of Navadas, Garland of Devotees, where it is stressed that Kabir's wide-ranging poetic compositions are a testimony to his being a non-partisan well-wisher of everyone, including Hindus and Muslims alike. 1600 में बकमाल टेक्स्ट टेक्स्ट है. किसी भी सूफी के बारे में, किसी भी संत के बारे में आपको ढूंढना है, वो टेक्स्ट मिलेगा. और ये जो गोरखपुर का गीता प्रेस वहाँ से वो छपा हुआ टेक्स्ट है. हिंदू तुरक परमान रामायणी सबकी साखी, पक्षपात नहीं वचन सभी के हित के भाषी. दिस इज भगवान. हिंदू तुरक परमान रामायणी सबकी साखी, ये फॉर्म्स हैं पोएट्री के, और ये हिंदू तुरक के प्रमाण है. और क्या प्रमाण है? पक्षपात नहीं वचन सभी के भाषी. ये प्रमाण है टेक्स्ट कबीर के. Anandas, a biographical text called Parchais, which is very famous once again, along with Bhakmal, Parchais, on the lives and works of most popular Bhakti poets of northern India in the 15th, 16th centuries. Anandas has shown how Ravidas, Raidas, and Dadu Dayal tried to convince Akbar of the need to transcend the Saguna divide as well. Ravidas pointed out that one should not have dogmatic. और कितना अच्छा मेटाफर इस्तेमाल किया है. You should realize that Nirgun and Sagun are the same. You must think of Sagun as of butter and Nirgun as of heated ghee. तो मक्खन खाइए पंडित और सन बनेंगे, तब करके हम लोग सन बनेंगे, वो हम लोग घी हैं. गोष्ठी बनाया, उस गोष्ठी में कबीर को बिठाया और चारों तरफ से सभी संतों को बिठाया. उनको लेके बिठाया. दरकारी बाई बहुत फेमस हैं, उनको लाके बिठाया और फिर कबीर को बोला आप छोड़िए ये निर्गुण सगुण का डिवाइड, इसको आपको नहीं मानना पड़ेगा. So the narrative goes very interestingly in such a way that suddenly in the middle of the conversation, when Kabir is not convinced, ब्रह्मा साक्षात वहाँ लैंड करते हैं, ठीक है, और फिर कबीर के अंदर समा जाते हैं। तो कबीर बेहोश होके कंप्लीटली गड़बड़ा जाते हैं। फिर जब वो होश में आके समझते हैं तो बड़ा देख लिया ना आपने, यही तो है जो अंदर रहते हैं। तो इसको छोड़िए। The appropriation of Kabir was sought to be legitimized through God miraculously appearing during the course of the conversation and entering Kabir's heart. The Brahman Shudra distinction of the Hindu caste or Varna hierarchy, because the Nirguns were all low caste people, Sagun could be mostly. Kabir would go to any length to make that happen. और बहुत सारे इंटरेस्टिंग दोहा हैं with regard to Kabir saying that distinction from the basis of religious identities, etc., especially has to be discounted, rejected. साधना 36 फॉर्म है, 36 लोग हैं, varieties हैं, साधना में लगे हुए हैं. Why should you be speaking about caste distinctions and pointing? The last example is about Darshiko, late, middle of the 17th century, studying monotheistic tradition. So he's attempt at writing that book called Raziuddin Bahrain, Meeting of the Two Oceans, and also his translation of as many as 50 Upanishads called Sirre Akbar, which is a very, very interesting text. He would say that all the scriptures have been derived from some text, and that text is nothing but Upanishad. So, in terms of Upanishad, which could be a blasphemous thing in the Muslim tradition, but he was not killed for that. He was killed for saying that there is commonality and similarity between Hindu tradition and Muslim tradition on the question of monotheism. This was what Aurangzeb's charge was, not on the other more interesting statement that he had made. So whereas the Hindu traditions were beginning Sanskrit texts being translated into Persian, and with the policy of what is that Akbar was practicing. Peace with all, or absolute peace, etc. In the middle of the 17th century, it was possible to imagine that the powerful Mughal prince could style himself after the ideal Hindu king, Lord Ram of Ayodhya. खराब करेंगे तो आप मलिशा यावना से करके डिस्कस. Akbar was the Orcha poet, Keshav Prasad Mishra. Akbar was Yavana, Malicha, etc. because Akbar was forcing the integration of Bundelkhand region and the Orcha court into the Mughal system. So he did not succeed. This led to Babul Fazl losing his head at the behest of Jahangir and Raziuddin. But by Jahangir's time, there was this understanding that Bundelkhand is part of the Mughal system. The same poet is now writing a whole biography as Ramkarta. So Jahangir just Chandrika, Moonlight of the Glory of Jahangir. एक किताब ही लिख दिया जहांगीर के फेवर में. I thought अकबर के फेवर में लिखा तो हमारा नेशनल बुंदेलखंड से मिला है प्रशस्ति. So ये जहांगीर को बोल. Darshiko was styling himself in such a way that he will be establishing a Ram Raj kind of position, and therefore जो वशिष्ठ के ट्रांसलेशन में वो देखता है कि वशिष्ठ ने राम को लड्डू का एक पूरा सेनी दिया है, दारुश को खिलाइए और फिर जनता को बांटिए कि ये आपका this is the legitimacy for him. Muzaffar Alam in his latest book Sufis and Mughals has written a long chapter on this idea of Darshiko is styling himself as a future, acceptable king like Ram of Ayodhya. So, my example, besides undertaking translation projects such as the Upanishads, as I mentioned, Bhagavad Gita and Yog Vashisht, Darshiko wrote several books of his own, including a couple of volumes on the lives of Sufis, Safinatul Awliya, Sakinatul Awliya, etc. But the most important one for our purpose is Majmu'ul Bahrain, or the Meeting of the Two Oceans of Islam and Infidelity, in which Darshiko presented the similarities between Sufi ideas and those in indigenous mystical and philosophical thinking since ancient times. Led by the ulama who gave the fatwa for his execution as demanded by Aurangzeb. It is important, therefore, to look at Majmu'ul Bahrain for Dara's views. What exactly is saying? or discourses, bayan, on some of the critical themes relevant for understanding the commonalities in religious and philosophical traditions. After paying tribute to God and Prophet Muhammad in his texts, as was the conventional practice, Dara Shikoh writes, addressing himself as a faqih, this faqih, in faqih, a Sufi mendicant, that after knowing the truth of truths and ascertaining the secrets and subtleties of the true religion of the Sufis, God and the love for him, he thirsted to know the tenets of religion of the Indian monotheists. मशरबे मुबहिदान हिंद के जो मुबहिदीन हैं उनका मशरब क्या है, उनका मजहब क्या है. Dara reports that after having long conversations with the accomplished scholars of this religion, कामियाने ईशान जो अच्छे परफेक्ट अकम्प्लिश्ड जो स्कॉलर्स हैं मोनोथीज्म के, इंडियन मोनोथीज्म के, उनसे हमने बात किया है. वो had attained the highest stage of perfection in religious exercises, comprehension of God, intelligence and insights. He says he did not find any difference except which he called ikhtilaf al-lafzi, in the way in which they sought to comprehend the truth. दरियाफ्तो शिनाख्त को उन्होंने लफ्जी बताया है. कुछ लोग संस्कृत में कर रहे हैं, कुछ अरबी का पर्शियन में कर रहे हैं. That's the only difference you would say. And then you will show that etymologically also they are very very similar when explained. So consequently, Dara Shikoh informs his readers after having collected the views of the two parties. One is the Sufi party, the Indian monotheist, Sufnane Fariqain, as one of these, two parties हैं जो एक दूसरे से भिड़े हैं. And having brought together the points, a knowledge of which was absolutely essential and useful for the seekers of truth, he had compiled this text, or Risala as he called it, and called it Majmul Bayan, as it was a collection of the truth and wisdom of two truth-knowing groups, Haqq and Shans, Bahar, ocean and Bahrain, two oceans. Asserting that Sufism was about adopting equity, insaf, and abandoning religious obligations, taklif in doing so, Dara Shikoh knows that he had to make a huge intellectual investment in terms of amount of thinking which has gone into the writing of this puzzle. He points out that the discerning and intelligent persons will derive much pleasure from reading this book, Majmul Bayan, while persons of blunt intelligence of either side will get no share of its benefit. जो उन ज़हन लोग हैं, उनको नहीं समझ में आएगा. उन फहमाने तरफ़ैन से. He also adds that he has put down these researches according to his own intuition and taste for the benefit of the members of his own family, and that he is not concerned with the common folk of either community. ये publicly नहीं. Otherwise also metaphysical, philosophical, mystical conversations are between those. Also, I might get lynched also. तो वो कह रहे हैं ये कम्युनिटी के जो लोग एक दूसरे को मारने को उतारूं, उनके लिए नहीं है ये, मेरे के लिए, मेरे ओन ट्रेनिंग के लिए है. He also asks that yes, all of these researchers लोगों से उनको कोई मतलब नहीं. मगर आवामे हर दो कौम नहीं, मुझे कौमों से कोई मतलब नहीं है. So intellectual conversation चल रहे हैं. This last point, as I said, was typical of the philosophical position held by early Islamic philosophers such as Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, Greek philosophy people, telling Imam don't take it to the public because public will not understand our language and then they will begin to create difficulties for it. Ghazali will say नहीं, इनकी किताबों में हेरासी है, इनकी किताबों को जला दो. So we know that this has also happened. Philosophers have been targeted for saying things which was not in conformity with the traditional orthodox conservative kind of adherence to Islam. So therefore, philosophers were pleading with theologians that the conversations and discourses of philosophers were not meant for the vast multitudes of people who should not be provoked for any perceived attack on their beliefs, क्योंकि वो तो अंधविश्वास उनके अंदर. Sunni Islamic revivalist Imam Ghazali did not refrain from burning the books written by philosophers. Here, Dara Shikoh was going to pay with his life, eventually. The politically charged ulama party did not agree with Dara, who was quoting even an otherwise respectable Naqshbandi Sufi, Khaja Nasiruddin Ubaidullah Ahrar. बहुत अच्छा शेर उन्होंने quote. In English, if I know that an infidel immersed in sin is singing the note of him, hear him, and I'm grateful to him. कि कोई काफिर भी अगर so we are grateful to go to that person. अगर दानन के काफिरी पुर खता ज़मज़मे तौहीद हंजारी मी सराय मी रबम अज़बी मी शनो सुनता हूँ और उनका मैं मिन्नतदार होता हूँ कि इतनी अच्छी बातें कह रहे हैं despite being a kafir. This is Naqshbandi Sufi. So there was this openness. Otherwise, Naqshbandi Sufism could be very conservative in not recognizing the virtues in other religious sections, etc. They eventually made a mess with the Mughal family, going all the way to late 17th century, middle of the 17th century onwards, etc. So Darushiko ने आगे क्या एग्जाम्पल दिए हैं? He went to topics which include elements, anasir, senses, havas, devotional exercises, havas, senses, devotional exercises, ashghal, attributes of God, sifat Allah Ta'ala, soul, ruh, air, bath, the 4 words, and then you will get Sanskrit equivalent also. 4 words, awali mein argaya, sounds, awaz, light, noor, vision of God, ruyat, the names of God, Asma'i Allah Ta'ala, 99 names or more, associationship and sainthood, Nabuwatu, Vilayat, lost as Alam Kubra of the Sufis of the great world, comprising the complete form of God. Brahman kya hai? Complete form of directions, jihad, meaning directions, skies, asman, earth, zameen, divisions of earth, qismat zameen, in interval between the death of a human being and the resurrection, barzakh, which is a waiting period between death and heaven or hell, which is referred to as barzakh. Resurrection, qayamat, salvation, mukti, from Sanskrit, mukti. बेनिहायत चलता रहेगा, continue करेगा, in the sense that the qiyamah will not happen in the sense that everything will be finished off completely. एक phase जाएगा, दूसरा phase continue कर जाएगा. बेनिहायत और अनादि प्रवाह, जिसका कोई अंत नहीं है. अनादि प्रवाह, continuity of days and nights without end. And for this last discourse, Darushiko quoted a celebrated Iranian poet Hafiz Shirazi in a very interesting language, which is the language of poetry of love, a ghazal variety. In English, there is no end to my story and that of my beloved, for whatever has no beginning can have no end. Majre mano mashuke mara payan nis, harche agaz na dalar, na pazirad anjam. जिसका आगाज नहीं है, उसका अंजाम भी नहीं है, खत्म नहीं होगा. Darushiko further argued for the continuity of days and nights, therefore, and quoting the Quran, and Quran says, as we originated the first creation, so we shall reproduce it. तो ये दुनिया इस तरह से चलती रहेगी. There are parallel दुनिया, ये हमारी दुनिया है इंसानों की. इसी दुनिया में एक इनविजिबल जिन्नात लोगों की भी दुनिया है, इंसोजेनस. 12 बजे रात के and then in parallel also आलम गायब भी है, इनविजिबल वर्ल्ड भी है यहाँ पे. उनमें से कुछ लोगों के पास हवा, those are the Sufi mystical awareness power, etc. Against the paranormal power. But insurgents are common. Quran continuously refers to not people, but जिन्नात लोगों को भी. और जिन्नात लोगों के बारे में बाद में सूफी इंटरप्रिटेशन है 17th सेंचुरी में कि अल्लाह मियां ने जब इंसानों को बनाया मिट्टी से, तो जिन्नात लोग जो है आप लोग हिमालय में जाकर रहिए, कभी कभी जरूरत पड़ेगी तो आपको भेजा जाएगा. सो जो sent to earth will be those jinnat people will take care of the badmashi of the insan people. महाभारत में भेज रहे हैं उनको कि भैया उसको ठीक करने जाओ, वहाँ पे बहुत पॉलिटिक्स है. So heading towards one example, heading towards conclusion. Darshi shows similar reconciliation of Hindu ideas about Brahman and Mukti, besides the concept of a universal God, that there was no difference between Islam and Kufr, was provocative enough for conservative Naqshbandi, Mujaddidi Sufis manipulating their access to the Mughal court. Since the time of Shaykh Ahmad Sarandi, we know Mujaddid al-Fiqani, there was serious from the point of view of peaceful coexistence, secularism in our society, pluralism, etc., was making very, very provocative statements, such as my favorite example of him saying that the biggest service to the cause of Islam is to slaughter cows. That certainly will sound very, very provocative. The result was Aurangzeb's easy justification of bloodbath on pain of death. What did he say? Faith and infidelity both and are exclaiming together, He is one, and that's what monotheistic God is about. Kufr Islam, Payam, Puyam, कोई शरीक नहीं है और सभी लोग चाहे वो कुफ्र पे हैं, ईमान पे हैं, सब उसी की तरफ जाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, जिनके रास्ते शायद अलग अलग हो सकते हैं, जो विच एक नाथ ड्रामा पोएम हिंदू तुर्क संवाद में भी कहा गया कि there may be 100 different ways through God, but they are doing the same thing eventually. So, but the aim of the people in terms of the religious domain could be together the sons along with Sufis, yogis, India's national culture of unity and diversity, enabling peaceful coexistence of religious traditions and practices. For this writer, I think all of us here, the Sufi Bhakti complex of medieval and early modern India remains a crucial marker of India's devotional tradition and cultural diversity, with all the competitions, appropriations, and distinctiveness as separate religiosity, with which the political domain must maintain respectful equigescence. Political domain should not be seen like using communities against each other, pitting them against each other, creating difficulties in the society, so that there is so much unrest. I think I'll stop now, but if there are questions I can take. Thank you.
Affirming